Today's broadcast is brought to you by viewers like you. Become a member today and unlock exclusive content at patreon.com/NorthstarRadio. Jon Stewart's return to The Daily Show has been ongoing for a couple months now, and I think it's opened the eyes of a lot of progressives in America to the trustworthiness or lack thereof that is American news coverage.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
During his time back on The Daily Show, Jon Stewart has not only interviewed those on the right, but also well-respected journalists on the quote-unquote left. And in doing so, he's been able to question the journalism of those seemingly on the right side of history.
What is his name? CNN.
CNN, the big red letters.
I've heard really...
Most trusted name in news?
What?
People who are covering the right things in a seemingly correct way. However, their words are a bit fluffy, to say the least. Coded in a lot of emotion and empathy, but lacking a lot of critical analysis necessary to understand such conflicts like Israel-Palestine. Something that Jon Stewart pointed out is not talked about with enough criticism on American television. There are quote-unquote progressive journalists who support women's rights, LGBTQ rights, black liberation, immigration reform, but when it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to geopolitics, they seem to be really hungry for war.
Sadly, because Mr. Milosevic has negotiated agreements which he has then ignored, I have supported the NATO bombings of military targets.
An error with fatal consequences. Barack Obama has apologized to Doctors Without Borders for the US bombing raid that mistakenly hit the NGO in Kunduz, killing 22 people.
We came, we saw, he died.
Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region.
To folks in this region who are thinking about making that dangerous trek to the United States-Mexico border, do not come. The United States will continue to enforce our laws and secure our border.
And by no means has Jon Stewart's return been universally praised. Many people, liberals even, have criticized his return.
Jon Stewart is facing massive backlash from Democrats over his comments about Joe Biden. Stewart's return to The Daily Show on Monday night opened with a 20-minute monologue going after Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Stewart especially mocked the current president after his disastrous press conference last week, where Biden struggled to assure Americans that he was still cognitively capable of performing his duties.
One of the main reasons being he's rightfully critical of Joe Biden, and for the most part, not afraid to be critical of any other liberal in American politics or media.
Know that America will call you out when you violate the basic tenets of humanity.
Weaponizing food, using it as a tool, as a weapon in its war against Ukraine, it's unconscionable.
Speaking of which, there is a literal famine in Gaza caused by the war. I assume America will also consider this unconscionable.
Absolutely, we're concerned about that. No question about it.
How about the free press? Ordinarily, we are strongly in favor of free press.
We also condemn the Russian government's continued targeting and repression of journalists.
You hear that, Russia? We condemn, in no uncertain terms, any repression of a free press. I think you all know what's coming next. More journalists have been killed in Gaza in 6 months than anywhere else in the world, and a new Israeli law says they can ban media outlets they consider a threat.
So as it relates to Al Jazeera specifically, we've seen the reports. If it is true, a move like this is concerning.
Oh, we're concerned again. How about if it's true, we condemn it? And by the way, is it true? Like, it feels like you could probably just call someone and be like, is this true? And if they're like, yeah, it's true, you could be like, that's concerning.
Demonstrating to his viewers that just because you're not far right doesn't mean you're a good person. And by the same standard, just because you're a liberal or a progressive doesn't mean you're a good person either. In a recent interview on The Daily Show, Jon Stewart demonstrated just that. Chief international anchor at CNN, Christiane Amanpour, made an appearance on The Daily Show, and she had some really fluffy things to say, and downright just inaccurate information.
CNN's chief international anchor and host of the Amonpour Hour. Please welcome to the program, Christiane Amanpour. Hello!
Jon Stewart immediately questions the legitimacy of one of the leading liberal news networks, CNN.
What is happening? What is the frustration? You're working over at what is the name of it? CNN.
CNN, the big red letters.
I've heard really
most trusted name in news.
What? That's a new branding.
We start off this interview with Jon Stewart asking, what's the main issue or issues with covering the conflict in Palestine? And Christiane goes on to say, we journalists can't get in there. There are no journalists on the ground in Gaza, when obviously there are journalists on the ground, yet Western media seems to never trust their accounts, and is fed lie after lie from the IDF when they aren't even in Gaza. Jon Stewart rightfully calls out this fallacy, acknowledging the 100 Palestinian journalists who have already been killed by Israel.
What do the journalists behind the scenes talk about as their frustrations? What would they like to see covered? How would they like to see it covered? Or are they executing it in the manner at which they think they're satisfied?
Well, here's the thing. You know, you've been talking a lot about Israel, obviously about Ukraine. Our major problem covering Israel-Gaza right now, this phase of it, which has been going on for 6 months, is that we can't get there. This is an unprecedented situation. Journalists are not on the ground in Gaza. And it is...
Well, they're journalists on the ground. They're being killed.
You're right.
Yes.
You're right.
She then goes on to basically admit that the Palestinian journalists aren't good enough journalists, and they can't be trusted. And that's why we need Western journalists on the ground. And by Western, she means white?
It goes beyond the horror of what's happened to those people and their families. It's about telling the story of Gaza, telling the story of the Palestinians. You know, actual local journalists would tell you about a people, right? A people, not just, you know, dehumanizing numbers or the like, but a people. And when we go to do our job, and I've been doing this pretty much since the first Gulf War, we go there to be the eyes and ears of everybody who can't go, from who's not a local.
This is an example of a greater issue in the delegitimization of Palestinian journalists. Over the weekend, the White House hosted their annual Correspondents' Dinner, which is basically an event where politicians, celebrities, and journalists, quote-unquote, honor distinguished print and broadcast journalists for excellence in overall coverage of the White House. Now, the United States, with help from Israel, has now killed over 100 journalists in Gaza and the West Bank. So holding an event celebrating journalism was obviously poorly received, and hundreds, if not thousands, of pro-Palestinian protesters made their voices heard, and hopefully fueled some guilt in the minds of attendees. The event was hosted by none other than SNL Weekend Update co-host Colin Jost. I truly had no idea how disgusting of a human being this man is, especially because Weekend Update is supposed to be a satire of mainstream news coverage. Not only is he gross, but he's simply not funny. Even without the context, his speech was so hard to watch. I might have to make a whole video about it. It was that bad.
Isn't it crazy, by the way, that TikTok could be outlawed in the US by the end of this year? That's a real shame, because we're gonna need TikTok to document who is storming the Capitol next January 6th.
And at the end of the night, several awards are given out to journalists. And can you guess who was given the award for overall excellence in White House coverage? Not a Palestinian journalist, a former IDF soldier turned journalist. And no, it's not just any IDF soldier, as every Israeli is required to serve. No, it was awarded to Barak Ravid, a member of the IDF's intelligence division, serving in 1998 all the way until 2023 as a reservist. There is a very high statistical likelihood that this man did absolutely nothing evil during his time in the IDF. Alright, let's get back to the Jon Stewart interview. Jon Stewart goes on to basically ask why military intervention continues to happen if it time after time fuels more grassroots violent movements.
You were covering these types of events from 1983. We all remember that was the occupation in southern Lebanon. It was right.
The Israelis invaded Beirut. They were after the PLO.
Right, and then there was the Lebanese Civil War. There was, and the rise of Hezbollah in that occupation. There was the Islamic Revolution in Iran. We're watching these stories play out redundantly.
Amonpour gives the classic liberal answer.
You know, there's two things, obviously. One is that, history is not always a great teacher, but the other is that, leadership matters. And we are in a crisis of leadership around the world, I genuinely believe. And even as bad as it was in the 1979, in the 80s and all that, there was a period, let's say, in this part of the world, in the Middle East, in the 90s, where there was an actual peace process. Now, we can poo-poo it, we can laugh at it, we can say that it failed, but it failed because the people responsible for enacting it didn't do it and actually sabotaged it. So there have been instances where peace can be forged, where both sides can come together, and it depends on the leaders,
It's not an apartheid problem, it's not a colonial or imperialist problem. The problem is with the leadership. It's not the system that's bad, it's the leader. Like when liberals say, America isn't bad, it's just Donald Trump. Or when Israelis say, it's not Israeli apartheid that's bad, it's just Benjamin Netanyahu. Using a scapegoat, obviously a very, very guilty scapegoat, to redirect anger and criticism away from the underlying problem and focus onto a symptom of the problem. Right-wing militantly hungry fascists. This next bit is where I really question the ethics and legitimacy of Christiane Amanpour. She doesn't seem to be neutral in this conflict, which is an incredibly low bar because there are not two sides in a genocide, but she struggles to be even neutral.
What does that even mean? What is the plan?
There are two things, right? Israel was attacked on October 7th, the worst single-day massacre in its history.
Of course.
And it has the right to defend itself, but, right, the issue is you stay within the guidelines of international law.
Christiane Amanpour is incorrect in this statement, and it's funny she brings up international law, because based on international law, Israel does not have a right to defend itself as an occupying state. In an article from The Guardian, a 22-year-old article by the way, states that the right of self-defense is used to justify actions in the occupied territories. However, there is no right of self-defense for an occupying force. Clearly, actions taken by the Palestinian people in land internationally recognized as illegally occupied by Israel are legitimate acts of resistance, subject only to the rules of war. And the rules of war do not forbid killing of civilians where this is unavoidable and a people's survival depends on it. Hey, don't take it from me. Take it from a 2002 article from The Guardian. But if that's not enough proof for you, the International Court of Justice in 2004 concluded that Israel does not have a right to self-defense in retaliation to the people they're occupying. In this report, titled Legal Consequences of the Construction of a Wall in the Occupied Palestinian Territory, they state, Article 51 of the Charter thus recognizes the existence of an inherent right of self-defense in the case of armed attack by one state against another state. However, Israel does not claim that the attacks against it are imputable to a foreign state. Therefore, Israel could not in any event invoke these resolutions in support of its claim to be exercising a right of self-defense, basically stating that much of the actions of October 7, even against civilians, are legal in the laws of war because their survival depends on it, and retaliation for the October 7 attacks are not legal. It's a hard pill to swallow. But occupation does not grant you the right to self-defense. You have full control over the people you're occupying. Therefore, any actions against you are at its core the fault of your own. Jon Stewart goes on to brilliantly question and poke fun at the incredibly biased journalism in the West.
So now you heard, America's getting very frustrated and concerned.
Well, we're very concerned.
Very concerned.
If Christiane, if true.
Western media consistently questions if the information coming out of Gaza is correct, even when there is incredibly clear video and photo evidence. They bombed Al-Ahli Hospital, and everyone in America trusted the IDF when they said it was a backfiring Hamas rocket. And since that bombing, nearly every hospital has been bombed. If Hamas really is hiding in hospitals, why would every single hospital be victim of backfiring Hamas rockets? Body bags of people with their hands zip-tied together were recently found at Al-Ahli Hospital. Clear evidence of mass executions, after videos were circulating of men and young boys being paraded around Gaza City, zip-tied and blindfolded. But once again, US media is believing the IDF and saying it's Hamas who committed these heinous crimes. Jon Stewart very intelligently points out the obvious. These crimes by Israel are disgusting, if true. Oh, new evidence shows it was Hamas. Never mind.
It reminded me of something that happened at the State Department during the Rwanda genocide, when a journalist asked the State Department spokesperson in 1994, 30 years ago this week, the woman said there have been acts of genocide committed in Rwanda.
Right.
And the reporter said, well, how many acts of genocide does it take for you to call it a genocide? And she said, I'm not able to respond to that position you're taking. So, you know, we have an issue.
I'm not a genocidologist.
We have an issue with calling what's happening, certainly back then.
This statement from Amonpour is very clear proof of the faults of liberalism. JT over at Second Thought illustrated this perfectly.
There's a great tweet that really sums up this liberal tendency. A liberal is someone who opposes every war except the current war, and supports all civil rights movements except the one going on right now.
All past struggles and movements are justified and praised even by liberals, except for the current ones. All past radicals and leaders of radical movements are praised by liberals, except for the current ones. All anti-war movements were correct in hindsight, but the current one is simply incorrect. She has no problem calling the Rwandan genocide a genocide, but when referring to Israel's actions in Gaza, she and many other people are very quick to call it a war. Jon Stewart continues his criticism of Biden and doesn't allow Amonpour to glaze Biden for seemingly having restraint over actions in Gaza.
You know, after 9/11, the vindictiveness in me, the blood, like, it certainly rose up. But very clearly, our response was flawed in its efficacy. We made a mistake.
And you know that President Biden said that to Prime Minister Netanyahu when he went there. So did Lloyd Austin. So did many Americans.
Right, but President
Don't make the
Biden,
mistake
when he was
that
in a
we made.
position to say that to America after 9/11, didn't say that. That's not the position that he took then. Then the position was, yeah, let's go into Iraq, let's go into Afghanistan. You know, it's easy in that retrospect.
Before I end this video, I want to point out a few more instances where Amonpour, although a seemingly socially progressive person, is incredibly hungry for the continuation of war, a moral fallacy that many liberals participate in, not just Amonpour. In her interview on Late Show with Stephen Colbert, she discusses Ukraine, and in a way to justify the continuation of this bloody proxy war, she makes an incredibly false claim that this is a war fighting for democracy.
America's not sending its, women and men. We are not in the West, and they are fighting a war to defend democracy in Europe. And it's a huge, big deal. And the fact that these weapons are not getting there is very significantly awful.
Now, I won't dive too deep in the Ukraine-Russia war because there is some nuance and a lot of context to discuss. But to state that it's simply a war for democracy is an incredibly evil way to get good-meaning liberals on board with the continuation of this war. And it's funny she brings up democracy, because the conflict really started all the way back in 2014. When the United States supported and funded a coup against a democratically elected neutral president to seat a much more anti-Russian president in hopes that a war against Russia would break out.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, what he needs is Klitsch and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week. I just think Klitsch going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work. So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it and, the EU.
She also uses American liberals' hatred of Trump to get them to support the continuation of Ukraine's war, stating that because Trump is against this war, we liberals need to support the war even more.
So when they say Trump, comes to say, I have a way to end this war in 24 hours, and his way involves telling Ukraine to cede territory to Putin.
Yeah, you can stop any war by surrendering.
Yeah, exactly.
I've won a lot of fights that way.
But But even, as you know,
Yes.
the bully in the playground is not stopped by surrendering. You got to slap him around. Anybody who has a puppy dog.
She is also very happy with more weapon sales to Ukraine, stating that we will not win this war if we don't send over more weapons.
He says, I can tell you that we will lose this war if we don't get the weapons. And for me, it's a tragedy because they are fighting our war. There's no Western boots on the ground. America's not sending its, women and men. We are not in the West. And they are fighting a war to defend democracy in Europe. And it's a huge, big deal. And the fact that these weapons are not getting there is very significantly awful.
She even admits that this is a proxy war between the United States and sort of Russia, but more so China because they're allied with Russia.
And for me, it's a tragedy because they are fighting our war.
In the end, these two interviews of Christiane Amanpour really help to illustrate the faults of neoliberalism, where people are incredibly progressive, supporting a plethora of social issues and social movements here in the United States, yet when it comes to war, they have no issue with taking those rights away from people all around the world. They'll even go to war and use their support for social progressivism as a reason as to why they need to go to war. It really illustrates how Democrats and Republicans ultimately have the same goals: control over the world as we see fit for the safety and prosperity of Western capitalism. Liberalism is simply supporting those goals, yet portraying yourself as one who is socially conscious. It's that classic meme. Republicans dropping bombs, and Democrats doing the same thing, but with an added bit of social progressivism. As Americans, we must always continue to question our role in policing the world. We must continue to question our actions in other countries, because at the end of the day, the purpose is not to protect my safety or your safety, but the safety of a select few individuals who profit off of war. And by destroying the economies of rising countries, they're able to boost our own economy for the sole purpose of filling their pockets with more dollars. Thank you for watching North Star Radio. Peace and love, and free Palestine.